care about research methods? I already gave you a little bit of a heads up, but remember, a big goal of this class is critical thinking. So there are different things we could do with research findings. We can just believe them without thinking too much about it. Yeah, that checks out. That sounds like stuff I experience. If you don't like violent video games, for example, you might be like, yeah, of course that makes children violent, without looking into it. You could ignore them. If you are super into video games, you could be like, that's just propaganda. I don't believe it. Or we can think critically and investigate, like we did with the black coffee study in psychopathy. Number 3 is what we're going to learn how to do throughout the rest of this class. Why do we care about that? A basic understanding of how we and others do research can really help us think critically about results and help us make better decisions. We can make educated conclusions about our findings. This is kind of a hot topic nowadays when there are groups of people who very strongly disagree about research findings. Some people who very strongly dismiss overwhelming research about things like climate change or systemic racism or mask wearing and the way that viruses spread. So it's incredibly, incredibly important for the health of literally everybody on the planet if people understand how to think critically about research and how to make educated conclusions about findings. We can disagree, but we can disagree for good reasons about research methods, not just because of our personal beliefs. So when people make a claim, we need to ask ourselves, is that information founded in research, or is that more of an opinion? And that's something we can investigate further when we try to find the sources that the journalists use when they write the articles. We also need to ask ourselves who conducted the research. Low-fat diets used to be popular back in the day, partially because sugar companies were conducting the research. If scientists found that sugar caused weight gain, the sugar companies would actually suppress that research and not let scientists publish their findings. And this was back in the 1960s or so when the low-fat diet became a huge fad. Now, the problem with low-fat diets of having low-fat versions of everything in the store is that they often included more sugar. So that benefited the sugar companies, but it didn't necessarily benefit their customers, as we know today. So a lot of that research showing that low-fat diets cause people to lose weight was research conducted by people who have a conflict of interest. They had money to be made by getting a certain result. So perhaps their research methods were not that trustworthy. Let's think about who paid for the research as well. It's a common thing that conspiracy theorists say, right, follow the money. But in research, we can do this as well. Who paid for the research? There used to be a lot of research in the earlier part of the 20th century showing that smoking cigarettes caused a lot of boosts to your cognition. But all this research showing that about cigarettes was paid for by tobacco companies. So, of course, they're not going to be showing you the negative health effects, and the effects of the cognitive boosts they found may or may not be trustworthy, right? So we need to think about who conducted the research, who paid for it. We also need to think about how it was done, just like we looked at with the black coffee study. When we actually looked at the methods, it didn't really sound much like what the headline was. So we can ask ourselves whether people took a survey. We can ask ourselves whether there was an observational study. We could ask ourselves whether there was some kind of face-to-face interactions, some kind of interviews going on, whether they had participants completing some kind of cognitive task in the laboratory, whether there were brain scans, what people were doing during the brain scans and what that means. We could ask ourselves whether the research was done on humans at all. A recent example from Kellogg's said that clinical studies have shown that kids who eat a filling breakfast like Frosted Mini-Wheats improve their attentiveness in school by nearly 20%. And you might go, holy crap, 20% just from eating Mini-Wheats? But isn't that full of sugar? Like, how does this work? So another question we can ask ourselves is, what was the comparison group? In this study, it turns out they compared children who ate Frosted Mini-Wheats to not children who ate some other cereal, but children who ate no breakfast at all. So we don't actually know whether they're 20% better in school or whatever is actually from Mini-Wheats or just from eating breakfast in general. In order to know that, we would actually want to compare mini wheats to competing cereals and see if that gave kids a cognitive boost, right? And if we wanted to know whether it was just breakfast in general that made them more effective cognitively, we might want kids to be eating a whole bunch of different types of breakfasts and measuring them over time and comparing them to kids who had no breakfast. Claims were so overstated and the research methods were so bad that there was actually a class action lawsuit where people who bought mini wheats actually got to get a rebate from the company